So now we're going to do a little more factoring. This time we're going to have 3 terms. But let's go back and make certain we understand what's going on with our factoring. If we can remember that when we're factoring, we're doing the reverse of multiplying, that helps us a little bit. Okay. So if I had x plus 2 times x minus 3, this first x, the x in the first parentheses times the x in the second parentheses is where we would get the x squared. That x squared is just going to copy down to this ending answer here. And that came from those first 2 spots. The 2 times the negative 3, this 2 times this negative 3 is how we got this negative 6 that ended up copying down right here. How we obtained the negative x, that came when we took the x times the negative 3 and the 2x, the positive 2 times the x, that's where we got that plus 2x. And then the minus 3x plus 2x gave us the minus x. So to get this second piece here, the second term, we took the 2 outsides and the 2 insides, and we multiplied them and either added or subtracted to get this minus x. That's everything we have to think about when we go to set up how we're going to factor. Some other things to keep in mind. When this is a minus back here, that meant that I had 2 different signs up here, because that's the only way something in this one times something in this one's going to give me a minus, because if the signs don't match. If I would have had a plus in front of that third term, that meant originally in the parentheses I would have had either 2 minus signs or 2 plus signs, because a positive times a positive is a positive and a negative times a negative is a positive. For the second term in front of that, we had a minus in this one, and that again came because I had 2 different signs, the plus and the minus, when I went to go. Here, let me go back one. Let's go back a little more than one. This sign right here, when I have 2 different signs, is going to come from the one that had the biggest product. This was a 3, this was a 2, 3's bigger. It has the minus, that's how I'm left with the minus. Because when my signs are different and I'm adding and subtracting, my answer is going to take the sign of the quote-unquote higher. So that's how this one comes. But if my signs would have been the same, then I just would have been adding, and so if it would have been 2 positives, I would have had a positive. If it would have been 2 negatives, I would have had a negative. That's the framework that we need to understand when we're going to factor for this set here. Pause the video so that you can write all this down. After you've gotten all this written down, then come back so we can talk about it. These are our steps for factoring when the form is that x squared plus bx plus c. What we have is we have a trinomial with degree 2, and the coefficient of that leading coefficient. So the coefficient of that first term, the term with the highest degree, is 1. When that's the case, we're going to figure out the factors from the first term so that we can get the stuff that's in the front of the parentheses. We're going to use the factors of the third term to get the stuff that's in the back of the parentheses. Then we're going to figure out if we have the right set by keeping this in mind. The middle product either is going to add or subtract to give us that second term. Some things to keep in mind. Third term sign is going to tell us whether or not we have 2 same signs or 2 different signs in the parentheses. If we're going to have 2 same signs, if the sign was originally a plus. So in front of that third term, I inserted the 2 here for 2 different. If in front of that third term you see a plus, then you have the same signs, which meant we need to add the middle two terms. The sign in the parentheses will match. They will either be both positive or both negative. And whatever sign you're going to use is going to come from that second term. If you have a minus in front of the third term, you're going to have two different signs, which means you're going to subtract the middle two terms. So the sign in the parentheses does not match. One will be positive and one will be negative. The one that gives you the quote-unquote higher product is the one that we're going to take the sign from the second term. So then the other one gets the other sign. Let's take care of an example. So the directions say to factor completely. That's because whenever we factor, we don't forget about what we learned originally. So first we learned how to factor out the GCF. So I always have to do that first. We learned factor by grouping second, but that's for 4 terms. This one is 3 terms. It's a trinomial, so the factor by grouping doesn't apply. 1, 2, 3 terms. Square right here. Even if it's not a square right here, we're still going to follow that same kind of pattern, okay? As long as it's 3 terms. We're going to do the exact same thing that we did before. Notice in front of that first term, there's a coefficient of 1. So we looked at it, we analyzed it to say, okay, this is why we're using those steps. Now we're going to go in and use those steps. So I'm going to come on side, and I'm going to make note of a couple of things. For my x squared term, I can only have, it has a coefficient of 1. We know that part already. So this is an x squared, so I'm going to use an x and an x. I can use 1x squared, 1 not an x squared, and just a plain old 1, but we don't do that. Okay? If that was an x to the 4th, then I do x squared and x squared. We like to make the x part, or the variable part, in the front parentheses match. If there's a variable in the back here, we'll make that match as well. Our focus when we're doing these is to focus on the numbers. Okay. So I know I'm going to have an x squared, so I'm going to have an x up front and an x up front. The 1 is just going to be a 1 and a 1. So I don't need to focus on that. I have a 25. My factors of 25 are 1 and 25. And then I also have 5 and 5. And so I'm making note of my factors. There's a plus sign right in front of the third term. X squared minus 10x plus 25. That plus sign tells me I'm going to have 2 same signs. The minus in front of for the second term tells me both signs are going to be negative. I'm not going to have a whole lot to worry about with the front parentheses because it's a 1 for the number, so it's not going to change anything when I go to multiply things out. So where I'm going to pay attention to is the factors for the third term. If I take a 1 and add a 25, that's going to give me 26. And I'm adding because I have the same signs, because of that plus in front of the third term. So I know that's not going to work. And if I do a 5 plus 5, that'll give me a 10. That's the one I want. I want the 10 because there's a 10 in front of that second term. So this is the set I'm going to use. And instead of having both of them positive, I'll just throw 2 minus signs in front. Notice I figured out what numbers I needed to add, then I went back and figured out the sign. So my first parentheses, up front in my 2 parentheses, it needs to keep my parentheses. I'm going to have the 2x's for the x variable. Coefficient of 1, don't need to worry about it. Back parentheses, I'm going to use the 5. I need a minus. So I'm going to put a minus in front of the 5's. If I would have needed a plus, I would have put a plus in front of the 5's. So this is potentially my answer. 2 things I have to do. The first thing I have to do is check it. When I take that x minus 5 and multiply by the x minus 5, I'm seeing if I get the original problem. X times x is going to give me an x squared. X times minus 5 is a minus 5x. A minus 5 times a x is a minus 5x. And a minus 5 times a minus 5 is a plus 25. Combine my like terms, I get my x squared minus 10x plus 25. When we learn how to multiply polynomials, there was an extra step I was writing there that I did not write this time, because as we go forward, we want to make certain we understand what's going on and we can eliminate some of those steps. If you need to, still write that step down. Write the x times x first. Write the x times the minus 5 so that you can see that that's this piece. Write the minus 5 times x so you can see it's this piece. Write the minus 5 times minus 5 so you can see it's that piece. Once I see that my check works, and I really should not have boxed off my check. Once I see that my check matches the original problem, then I know what I have is correct. So this is almost my final answer. I told you there was 2 things to check. That's the first thing I checked. The second thing I need to check is to see if any of these match. And these 2 match. I have a x minus 5 parentheses that's written 2 times. And it's 2 times with multiplication. That means it's the same as an exponent of 2. So instead, I rewrite it with the exponent of 2. If you're factoring and you end up seeing the same parentheses more than once for that factored part, once you're done factoring, then you're going to write that parentheses 1 time and you're going to use the exponent instead. So if you see 2 parentheses, you're going to put a 2 exponent. If you see 3 parentheses, you put a 3 exponent. We're not going to have the 3 parentheses. Let's do another one. First thing to notice is there's a coefficient of 1 in front of the beginning, that x squared plus 4x minus 32. There's a coefficient of 1 in front of the x squared. So that means I can focus just on the back part, the minus 32. The 1 I'm not going to worry about, but I'm going to go ahead and write it down anyway. But I'm going to worry about my 32. I have 1 times 32. I have 2 times 16. I have 4 times 8. And I have, who else? Who am I missing? I think that's about it. So I have to check all these factors. The minus sign in front of the third term lets me know I want to subtract. The positive sign in front of the second term tells me that when I figure out my factors, and I should say when I go to figure out what those products are going to end up being, I want the bigger product to have a positive. And right now it's just a matter of looking at it in terms of factors. Later on, when we put a number in front of that x squared, that's why I'm emphasizing product. So let's see who I can subtract to get a 4, a positive 4. 1 and 32, that's not going to work. 16 and 2, that's not going to work. 8 and 4 will work because 8 minus 4 will give me a 4. Then I go back and double check my signs. The middle term had a positive, so I need the 8 to have the positive, so that it'll be the positive 4. So I put my x in the front of both parentheses. Whatever that variable is, I split it evenly. So 1x in the front one, 1x in the back one. For the 32, we said we wanted to use the 8 and a 4. The 8 needed to be positive. The 4 needed to be negative. Now I can do my check. When you check, if you set up the first and parentheses and the second parentheses correctly, the only part you really need to check would be this piece, that positive 8 times the x. And the x times the minus 4. That's the only pieces you need to check. If you make certain you're using the factor of the first one up front, the factor of the second one in the back, then the ones you really need to check are those two. That's my answer. What if this problem instead would have been x squared minus 4x minus 32? If that problem would have been x squared minus 4x minus 32, it would have been just a little different. So let's see how different it would have been. So I just copied down some stuff real quick. I copied down the part about subtracting because of the minus. I copied down the part about using that second term to figure out the higher sign. Then, because all I did was change the sign in the middle, I just copied down the 32 factors were 4 and 8. If I subtract those two, I'll get the 4. Okay. Because I have a 4 in the front of the second term. So now I need to go and check my sign. See, when we subtract, we automatically put that bigger number up front. That's why I put that bigger number up front. But now I'm going to go and figure out my sign. This needs to be the higher one, the negative, because it was the sign of the second term. So that means the 8 has to have the minus, which means the 4 is going to have the plus, so that I can get the negative 4. So now I'm going to have x minus 8 and x plus 4. Our direction said to factor completely. So let's look at an example where we need to make certain that's what we're doing. So I made this one a little hard. What makes this one a little hard is there's a negative in front of the first term. So we have negative x squared minus 6xy minus 8y squared. We previously said, when we were doing the factor by grouping, that when that first term is negative, you have to factor out that negative first. I need to now I can work this problem without factoring it out first, but that means I got to adjust how I was doing things. So I'm not going to adjust how I was doing things, I'm just going to factor that negative out in front. Factoring out the negative means that I'm just switching the signs. Originally I had a minus x squared, now in the parentheses you see a positive x squared. Originally there was a negative 6xy, now in the parentheses is a plus 6xy. Originally it was a minus 8y squared, now it's a plus 8y squared. That's factoring out the negative. So then for what I have left in the parentheses, I need to try to factor that. On this one, not only do I have a variable up front, but I have a variable in the back. I have the x squared up front and I have the y squared in the back. So this means that in the front parentheses, I'm splitting the x's, and in the back parentheses, I'm going to split the y. Write that down so you can make a note of it for later. In the front I have x squared, so its coefficient is 1. So its factors are just 1, nothing to worry about. The back parentheses I have an 8. Its factors are 1 and 8, 2 and 4. Because again, my focus is just on this part. The parentheses. The third term is a positive, so I know I'm going to need same signs. The second term has a positive, so those same signs will be positive. So I need to find the factors of 8 that's going to add to give me a 6. And they're both going to end up being positives. So then I go through my factors and I check. One and 8 will give me 9, 2 and 4 will give me 6. That's the one that I need. And then I know I want that to be both positive because of the note that we already made. So now I'm going to factor that parentheses. In the front, I'm going to have an x. In the back, I'm going to have a 2, a positive 2, and a positive 4. Because the third term had a y squared there, I have to split the y's. One will go in the first parentheses, the other one will go in the back parentheses. So we evenly split the variables on the front parentheses. If you have a variable in the back, evenly split it in the back. Last thing I have to do is that negative that I factored out, I have to carry that down. Let's do another one. X squared minus x plus 1. Again, my focus is going to be on that plus 1 because the x squared part has a coefficient of 1. My factors of 1 are just 1 and 1. I need to add to be able to get a negative 1x. And when I add, those signs are going to both be negative. There's no way for me to add a 1 and a 1 to get a 1 or a negative 1. There's no other factors to check. There's nothing I can do. When there's nothing I can do to work this problem, we write prime. That means its only factors are 1 and what the original problem was. So we just write prime. Last one, which is also a little tricky. On this problem, how they're trying to trick us is that the problem's not in descending order. I need it in descending order. When we looked at the patterns, when the polynomial was written in descending order. So that's the first thing I'm going to do. So the negative 20r plus 42 plus 2r squared is going to become 2r squared minus 20r plus 42. Now that I have it in descending order, now I can go ahead and work things how we were doing. Remember, we said we have to keep in mind our first stuff we learned. First thing we learn is factoring out a GCF. I can factor out a GCF. There's a 2 in front of each of these. When I factor out my 2, in the parentheses, I'm going to get an r squared minus 10r plus 21. And that's because 2r squared divided by the 2 is going to give me the r squared. The minus 20r divided by the 2 is going to give me a minus 10r. The plus 42 divided by the 2 is going to give me a plus 21. So now I need to check to see if I can keep going. So I'm dealing with just this big old parentheses now. In front of the r squared is a coefficient of 1. It's 3 terms. So I'm going to look to do what we've been doing. In front of the r squared is a 1. That makes it easy. It means I don't have to worry about it, and I just can focus on the 21. It's a plus in front of the 21, so I need same signs, which means we're adding. And both signs are going to be a negative because the second term has a negative in front of it. 1 and a 21 is not going to give it to me, but a 3 and a 7 will give it to me. And I need both signs to be negative, so I just make both of them negative so that I can get that negative 10. So in my first parentheses, I'm going to split the r's evenly, one up front, one in the back, so that I have my 2. The back parentheses, one's going to have a negative 3, the other one's going to have a negative 7, and I need to carry down my 2. And that's going to be my final answer. I want to make a comment about checking this one. When you go to check it, that r minus 3 times the r minus 7, you can multiply that first if you'd like. Or you can take and multiply the 2 first times the r minus 3. What you cannot do is multiply the 2 times the r minus 3 and then also multiply the 2 times the r minus 7. You can't do that. So 2 times the r is 2r. 2 times the minus 3 is a minus 6. That whole thing I have to multiply by the r minus 7, so I put it in parentheses. Now I'm going to take the 2r times the r, the 2r times the minus 7, the minus 6 times the r, the minus 6 times the minus 7. Then when I go and combine my like terms, I'll get 2r squared minus 20r plus 42, which is the original problem. It's not written in the original order. Here's our original problem. It's not written in the original order, but that is the original problem, so it checks. And that's our factoring of the form x squared plus bx plus c.